All right, welcome to Witchpolice Radio. Here I am again in the basement on the internet, which is hopefully changing soon. I mean, when I first did this show for the first like 7 years of it, I was meeting musicians in person and having conversations face to face. The internet is kind of the compromise now due to COVID, but it looks like maybe things are turning the corner. But the guest on this episode is someone who is new to the show. As regular listeners might know, I've been trying to broaden my horizons a bit. It's very easy for me to sort of stick with the genres that I'm super comfortable with and just do that forever. But I do listen to a lot of jazz, and I've been venturing more into interviewing jazz artists on the podcast recently. So here's another one. I think that people are enjoying them, so I'm happy to kind of delve more into that world. And the guest on this episode is well, you know what? To start this off, why don't you introduce yourself and maybe give a bit of background, because you don't necessarily have the same history as a musician as a lot of the local artists I talk to.
Yeah, well, my name's Jon Gordon, and I'm originally from Staten Island, New York. I'm in my ninth year here in Winnipeg teaching at the University of Manitoba Jazz Program. And we were just talking before we went on air about the fact that you had Jocelyn Gould and Will Bonas, who are
Yeah.
friends of mine. Will and I teach together, and Jocelyn was a former student. Um, yeah, so I mean, I'm actually in my 29th year of teaching
Oh wow.
jazz at a college level, but my ninth year here in Manitoba. And yeah, so I mean, one of the things that was really nice when I first came up and was getting to know about Winnipeg. It's really a great cultural city. I love the symphony,
Yeah.
you know, and there's a lot of yeah, it's just a lot of things that a lot of pluses culturally to the city for sure. And I love the all of the classical and jazz musicians around the music program, you know, where I teach.
So you're obviously, people who are in the music school here that they're going to recognize you. People in the jazz scene will know who you are. How did you why Winnipeg? How did you find this spot on the map when you first started teaching here?
I was invited to apply for the job. I came up and interviewed, and they hired me. You know, and there's some very talented jazz musicians that have come through that have been a part of the program. Derek Gardner is currently a part of the program. Quincy Davis was here when I first got here.
Hmm.
Very accomplished jazz drummer and composer. Teaches now at North Texas State. It's a very famous jazz program. George Colligan, brilliant keyboard pianist. Keyboardist, pianist, and multi instrumentalist. Actually, was here for a couple of years. Jimmy Green, a
Yeah.
really great saxophonist, was at the school before I was here. So there's a great tradition of some high level players. So I was really thankful to be able to come through and be a part of the tradition.
Does this seem, or did this at the time, I guess, seem like the place where the type of city where jazz could flourish? Because I mean, we're fairly isolated. I think outside of maybe the prairies, no one really gives much of a second thought to Winnipeg. Aside from maybe the art scene here, I think is maybe the sort of what people know about it besides the negative stereotypes of the cold and the
Hmm.
mosquitoes and all that, right?
Hmm. Well, it's funny, the mosquitoes haven't been as bad. A lot of
They
times
haven't.
in
Yeah.
this, yeah, they haven't been as bad in recent years. I heard about the reputation, and even like folks I know, like in Minnesota, would talk about, oh, the mosquitoes are terrible. So I'm not sure. They haven't been as bad in recent years. I'm away parts of the summer. My kids they're grown now, but they're in New York. So,
Yeah.
and I tour and things like that in non-COVID times. So, no, but I do feel that Winnipeg can be and really has been a place where jazz has flourished to an extent, and it has been a jumping off point for a lot of people that are having great careers. Curtis Noasa, Jocelyn
Yeah.
Gould, Joanna Majoko, a lot of great, people that are doing wonderful things have started out here. Luke Selleck is playing with a lot of great people. So yeah, and you look at the people that are teaching in our program, like Will Bonas and Carly Epp and Carl Kohut. They came through the school. Carl and Carly did their master's degrees in New York at Manhattan School of Music and Juilliard. And so, and they spent some time in New York. And so, as I tell people when I was in New York, like it's an important place to come and spend some time in, but you don't have to spend your whole life there, right?
Right.
You
Right.
don't need to be there 30 or 40 years. And to the extent that you can go to a place like that, or maybe to a place like New Orleans, which still has which is a very important cultural
Yeah. Yeah.
city with our music. There's things you can go there from being in the culture for some time and being immersed in that, in that environment, and then bring back to places like Winnipeg or wherever you are from originally. That's going to enhance the music scene there.
And that inspires the next generation of players too, who want to follow in those footsteps. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah.
So you have a new record that's about to come out, and I definitely want to talk about the album. But just before we get into that, what is yours? I mean, in a non-COVID year, what is your kind of division of time between? Because you're still making music, you're still performing, you're still recording. How do you divide that with the teaching aspect of things?
Well, it's funny. I sometimes joke with my students that when I was, particularly by the time I got to college, I always would make these lists, and I'd have to practice a certain amount of time every day to feel like I was a good person, like I did 4 hours, I'm a good. So I've got kind of, 2 or 3 hours a day. I like to work on music. I like to do something physical and be outside, walk, bike,
Yeah,
do something. Because I feel like you've got to kind of, particularly with what we're going through, like you can't just sit inside and be in front of a screen all the time. You got to get some exercise and some sunlight. Teaching, when we're in session, as when classes are going, I'd say it's probably 25, 30 hours a week in terms of the actual teaching and the prep and
sure.
grading and things like that. And then just finding that if I can have, 2 or 3 hours a day to work on music and do the other things I do as, in my life, then look for that kind of a balance. And if I'm really working on a project, when we were really working on that, like last fall and the start of this year, then it'd be a lot of other things going on in terms of writing, arranging,
Yeah.
and all of that kind of that goes into a recording.
And then as far as actually playing shows and things like that, obviously, again, COVID has kind of killed that for everyone for the last little while until fairly recently. But what is your typical? I mean, how much do you get to actually go out and perform and tour in the time that you've been an instructor, been a teacher?
Well, it's funny because I'm in the process of doing some writing about that because I'm
Okay,
planning a sabbatical in a couple of years and going back and forth with the dean and saying, well, this is what I would do in a normal year. So, for example, in 2016, I went to Europe for several weeks. I went to South Korea for 2 weeks. I
oh
was
cool,
in California for, I don't know, 10, 12 days. There's certain things that I go and do in New York. I used to play a club there called the Catano, played at Dizzy's. Uh, I used to do a lot of Monday nights at the Vanguard with the Vanguard Jazz Orchestra. I haven't done any the last couple of years. The last one I did was in 2019, probably. Used to sometimes play with the Mingus Band. They had a steady Monday night at the Jazz Standard.
cool.
So basically, then in 2017 I went back to Europe. So I mean, I would maybe travel a little bit more than I do if I didn't have my teaching job, but it still basically allows me to tour a good bit, to go to New York where I still have a lot of roots
Yeah,
and do things there. And yeah, so I mean, I think that's kind of the balance that we try to strike is playing in a few places. And like you said, things have eased up a little bit. So I did do several gigs and a recording in New York this summer.
oh cool.
I was out listening to music, jamming a little bit. And I'm actually playing a gig to celebrate the CD release at the Rachel Brown Theater on October 1st as part of a series with Jazz Winnipeg with a group of mine.
Oh great.
So yeah, so things are starting to normalize to an extent, we hope.
Hopefully, yeah. Hopefully, by the time this comes out, things haven't reversed themselves.
Exactly.
but yeah, no, it's looking good so far for sure. So the record is coming out on the 27th. Is that right?
17th.
17th. Okay, I had that backwards. The wrong first number. So I've been listening to it quite a bit. I got an advanced copy of it, and I really like it. First of all, it's a really good album. But the most striking part of it, I think, for me was just the very first song and how kind of chaotic it is and discordant and noisy it is, really, because I mean, as someone coming from a punk rock background, what initially drew me to jazz was that sort of side of things, when I could,
Hmm.
because when I was younger I had this idea of what jazz was, and it was, I think a lot of people do, where it's not cool. It's something that is, for old people. And I feel dumb about having that opinion now, because the more I listen to, the more I appreciate it. But that sort of kind of rawer side of it is really what appeals to me as a listener. What is and the rest of the album doesn't necessarily follow that song. It's just kind of a really cool statement at the beginning of the record, though, to start off with something that heavy, really.
Well, thank you. You know, the album was recorded here in town. The basis for the record was recorded at Stereo Bus Recording, Paul Yu's studio, with his partner Jen, who's a marvelous artist, and they're both really great people and great to work with.
Yeah,
And so it was Julian Bradford on bass, Fabio Ragnelli on the drums, Will Bonas on piano on most of the tracks, and then Jocelyn Gould on the guitar. So now the other person who was local, actually several people, other local people did it, but they recorded remotely because we figured that the only thing we could do safely, the 5 people was the most we felt we could safely get in the studio, right?
okay.
And so our jazz trumpet professor Derek Gardner said, "Well, I'm already set up to record at home." He had done a couple of projects that way. He said, "Send me the files and the tracks, and we're good," you know. So then also our jazz guitar prof Larry Roy played a solo in one of the tracks. And then I had 3 recent graduates, Reginald Lewis, who played some tenor, Tristan Martinson played some tenor, and Anna Blackmore played some bass clarinet. And then in addition, we had John Ellis, who's one of my favorite saxophonists and great bass clarinet player, great Alan Ferber, who's a great jazz trombonist and arranger and composer. He arranged 2 of the pieces.
Cool.
I composed all of them. I arranged the rest other than those 2. And then we had Orrin Evans guested on a couple of things. So Orrin was in Philadelphia, Alan was in St. Louis. And so what I was thinking with this is that there's certain possibilities that, you know, with every challenge, sometimes there's a blessing or a possibility.
Yeah.
And I thought, what if we play a free improvisation here, and I just ask everybody where they are to just, you know, just even without hearing it, I just gave them. I said I basically asked for 3 or 4 little different free improvisations, and that was the one that we used. And
Oh,
all
cool. Okay.
3 of them, all of them were different actually in terms of, you know, what I had initiated or suggested, and we just put it together, and it sometimes sometimes cacophony can have its uses, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it works
Uh,
for sure. Like as a piece, it definitely works.
and you know, one of my all-time favorite records is uh, called Word of Mouth by Jaco Pastorius.
Okay.
And if you're a punk rock guy, like all those rock bass players, like they all worship
Oh,
Jaco,
for
you
sure.
know.
Yeah, yeah.
And so the first piece on that record is called Crisis, and it's also a free improvisation. It's sort of based on this kind of little vibe that he's doing on the bass, and it's kind of like a kind of a double time Latin thing. And there's all these different people that are recording remotely, and what comes of it is what comes of it. And I was kind of imagining something like that. Sometimes if you start with something really in left field, it's like the verse before a standard. It creates something that sets up what's going to follow in a different, you know, it just creates, if that piece that was going to follow it was just by itself, it would mean one thing.
Yeah.
But coming after that other texture, it kind of creates a different context for it.
Well, maybe a follow-up question to that then, based on what you just said, is, I mean, we're in a world now where, unfortunately, most people aren't listening to an album start to finish. I feel like jazz might be one of those genres where, you know, the fan base is maybe more inclined to sit there and listen to something as a full, you know, as a full album start to finish. But how much of your record and of your work in general do you plan ahead like that? We're knowing that this, you know, the flow of the actual record itself, rather than individual tracks, which is kind of the way that things are going for all types of music these days.
You know, I try to have a record have a sense of continuity and some meaning that it means something to me
Yeah,
that I hope does for other people. But what I tend to do is I go in with certain possibilities in mind. Like I could have started with the thing that was the 3rd or 4th tune on the record. I could have started with,
yeah,
you know, if that free improvisation didn't work quite the way I wanted it to, I could have started the record a different way. So sometimes I go in and think, well, that piece, Pointillism, was something I had been planning all along, but I didn't know how it was going to work. So I was thinking, okay, I'm thinking this could be a nice texture that would set up things that would follow it, but Another option would be to start with this piece, Dance, that was actually probably the fourth thing on the record or something like that,
Right,
fourth or
right.
fifth. Um, and really, I wrote the piece Stranger Than Fiction, I think in 2001, and also Havens, because at that time I felt like, I'm not going to tell you I was that prescient that I saw the craziness that was going to come almost 20 years later, but I felt like some things that I had taken for granted in terms of the perception of shared reality were not as I had hoped they were.
Right.
And I was a little concerned, and sometimes you see these things in your own personal life, you see it in a community, and then you see it sort of, in the micro and the macro. And on a number of different levels, I'd say in recent years, I've just looked at like, wow, we do not have shared perception of reality, and we
Yeah,
don't
for
have,
sure. Yeah.
and so that's a challenge, and we experience many things internally in a personal way, but there are certain things like that we have to kind of have some kind of shared um, perspective and response to. Otherwise, we can't really move forward in any kind of positive way.
Right.
So, and I think, so there's very obvious statements about what we're dealing with in the world and the environment and the virus and all of that. Um, and then just how we treat each other as human beings and trying to find, certain things that to me, it's like, no, you don't do that. You do this, but it's not, some of those things are not as accepted. And sometimes, yeah, just, um, I guess that was a big inspiration for the record. And I'm a big George Carlin fan. He said, humanity is, human beings are really amazing, but I sort of go out to the Oort cloud and I just look at it. I just go along for the ride. I'm in for the entertainment. And so sometimes I imagined writing a piece called "Visiting George at the Oort Cloud." I may write a piece with that title at some point, but I still feel very invested, and just
Yeah.
very like, no, I can't. As much as a genius as I think he is, and one of my heroes in a certain kind of sense, him, Richard Pryor in that world, and no, I think like you have to. There's certain things you just have to stay and try to work out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that was some of the things I was kind of thinking about when I was writing that music.
Well, it's interesting. It's always interesting to hear the background, especially with instrumental music, right? Because I mean, if I'm talking to someone who has a vocal album, obviously not always, but usually the messaging behind the songs and the meaning is, if not clear, it's at least there to kind of read into. Whereas
Sure.
instrumental music, you're really getting whatever each individual person's getting something totally different from it, most likely, because
Hmm.
there isn't that sort of obvious hook to what it's about, right?
And I think that's very valid. I think, just the same way, like I might have a concept in mind going into
Yeah,
the studio or going onto a gig. And then great musicians come and they have a different energy and a different conscious and unconscious thought that emerges. And then like what's going to happen is something that I could never have conceived of. And so it just expands what's possible. I think it's the same thing with listeners,
hmm,
I think Duke Ellington said something like there are only two kinds of music, music that speaks to you or it doesn't. And if it speaks to somebody and they take meaning from it, I'm honored and thrilled, and I wouldn't
yeah,
be like, no, I meant it to be this or that, like, so because I think obviously, we're all seeing and experiencing everything through the prism of our own perception. So
for sure.
it's great if it has any meaning for anybody,
Well, it's out of your hands once it's out in the world anyway, right? It's
for
open to
sure,
being interpreted by whoever, however. So
for
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
I was just thinking, so you come from a punk rock background?
Mostly, yeah. I mean, I played in a lot of punk bands and stuff when my teen years and everything, and that's sort of I sort of took punk rock and went in all the different directions that genre can take. And so, like, I listen to all kinds of stuff, but that was
What
sort of
what
my roots, I guess.
what was your original inspiration?
Like, what music did I first get
Yeah,
inspired
yeah.
by? Probably the band that really did the most for me was the Bad Brains. and
I didn't know those guys. Okay.
it's they're still around, but it was late 70s, early 80s. They were four black guys playing punk rock, which was rare to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
They played a lot of reggae as well. They were Rastafarians,
Mm.
and they they actually were a jazz fusion band before they moved over to punk rock. So they're kind of incredibly talented players, and they could play with skill at a speed that no one else could play at the time. So their
Yeah.
stuff is super technical and twice as fast as everything else.
Was this like a New York CBGB's kind of
It was
thing?
they were from DC.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's
Because yeah, it's interesting. Like some of the early Police, obviously Stuart Copeland is
sure.
Canadian, and obviously the Ramones are really big. Like when I went to high school at Performing Arts High School in 1980, when I was 13, like everybody would come in with their Ramones T-shirts and
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah,
And I never went through a punk phase or anything, but I've had a lot of students that were like really into rock and and I could sometimes work them the way that I could sometimes bring them in, as I say, is if you think about the importance of John Coltrane and how he affected the Doors and
yeah,
Carlos Santana and a lot of the music that was like if it hadn't been for some of that late train, that's a
yeah,
huge connecting, energetically kind of connecting space to um, Hendrix
for sure.
and a lot of that hard stuff, and then that led into punk and all of that. So yeah, I find it interesting where you can find connections in that way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that like what I just from doing this show for as long as I have and talking to a lot of people in different genres of music, the thing that sort of draws people, I think, to punk rock and folk music and some of those genres that are seen as more simplistic is the whole concept of three chords and the truth, right? I mean, it's
Hmm.
you have the basic structure of a song and it's what you're putting into it, and that's what people are taking out of it. It doesn't have to be overly complicated, but it has to be, the message is there. And I think
Right.
jazz does that in a different way. I mean, it's obviously in most cases a lot more technically complex, but it's still the idea of putting out that message directly and sort of meaning what you're saying, I think. And
Yeah.
that comes through in the
Yeah.
jazz that I like anyway.
Yeah. Thad Jones wrote a great piece. He was one of the great big band writers of all time. Mean what you say.
Yeah,
Mean what you say what you mean. I think great art, great music does that. I think with jazz musicians, I think like what you were just talking about, three chords and the truth. Yeah, I think there's an immediacy there sometimes that
sure.
people can relate to, and sometimes with jazz, it's almost like there's a lot of other stuff going on, but it still should be that same thing at the core of it. So, like you were saying at the beginning, sometimes the perception with jazz is that there's this kind of old-timey kind of conservative thing, and I come
Yeah,
from the tradition. I love that. I love all that, but I also love Weather Report and like I said, Late Train
yeah,
and Cannonball Adderley groups going into the '70s. The crossover stuff, and I love it all. I love more contemporary people like Alan Holdsworth, who's a people like all the great rock guitar players talked about him as like the greatest guitar player that ever lived, kind of thing.
yeah,
Um, very very sophisticated harmonically and melodically, but but if you're telling the truth, you know what I mean? Like it's just other ways of telling that story. Charlie Parker used to talk about that. He said there's infinite ways to tell to tell these stories and stories and stories to tell. And
yeah,
so I think it's just a different way of kind of telling a story musically. And to me, if you're a high level jazz musician, you can do anything. So when you think about Sting's bands, when
sure.
he left the Police and he had Kenny Kirkland and he had Branford Marsalis, or when Sonny Rollins performed with the Rolling Stones and things like that,
Yeah, yeah.
or Wayne Shorter with Steely Dan, or Phil Woods with Steely Dan. So that's Freddie Hubbard with Billy Joel and things like that. So
Yeah, I guess if you have the chops to be able to handle jazz at a high level, you can definitely kind of retrofit that to something else.
yeah, and not only instrumental chops, but kind of theoretical. Like you have to be. I remember James Moody telling me when I was a kid. We were talking with Eddie Chambly, who I was sitting in with. I used to sit in regularly. Eddie had been married to the great Dinah Washington, one of the
Oh
great
wow.
jazz and blues singers of all
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
And James and Eddie were sitting there, and he said, people don't realize we could write a symphony if we wanted to write a symphony, because basically to be a high level jazz musician, that's the kind of thinking, that
Right.
you're dealing with. But it's just, to me, what's cool about it is it's one of the few art forms where what's really happening in the moment is completely, it's about that improvisation. It should be completely different every night you play it. And then when you bring in the compositional aspect of it, it's like when you're composing, you're thinking the way a painter or a sculptor or a poet works, or a
Right. Right.
novelist. But there's not as many. Now, if you see live music of any kind, it's great, it's exciting. But if you're watching the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra and they're playing Mahler's First, well, the tempos might be a little different from night to night, but the notes are the same,
It's the same thing. Yeah. Yeah.
right? And with rock bands, even with jam bands, it's a little bit more. It is some of it's a little. It has that inspiration from jazz and improvisation, but it doesn't have as much of that.
Yeah.
So that's the thing I love about jazz is that it's got this in the moment thing, like watching a great drip painter,
Yeah.
like a
Yeah.
Jackson Pollock, and then it's got the other thing where you're working on things over weeks and months.
Yeah, it's really unique in that way, I think, as far as musical genres go. One thing I wanted to ask you about the record too is, and this sort of connects to the punk thing in the sense that one of the things that also I think draws a lot of people to that kind of stuff is that it's got the DIY aspect, the idea that anyone can do this, you can do this yourself, you don't necessarily need the a master's degree to be in a punk band, right? But your record was put out by some kind of crowdfunding setup, wasn't it?
Yes, so Artist Share was actually the first crowdfunding. It was the forerunner of all of that.
Oh, really? Okay.
And it was a woman that I used to work with quite a bit named Maria Schneider introduced me to her friend Brian Camilio that runs Artist Share. And she was the first artist in any genre to win a Grammy for a CD that was not released in stores.
Hmm.
And that was 2003 or 4.
Yeah, that's way ahead of all
And
this stuff now. Yeah, yeah,
exactly. And so Artist Share was kind of the beginning of that. So I reached out to them in 2005. Like, I'm still very 20th. I'm 54 years old. I'm still very
yeah,
20th century in my mindset. I'm like, I want to go to Tower Records and look at all the records and the CDs and read the liner notes. And,
yeah,
you know what I mean? So the last, 15, 18 years has been, particularly the last 15 years really is since I've been involved with Artist Share. That's where I really was like, I guess I need to buy a computer. I guess I need to become computer literate, and
yeah.
all that kind of stuff. And so it's been a learning process, and your Artist Share was really groundbreaking with that. I know Trey Anastasio of Fish has done some stuff with them, and there's a lot. It was mostly designed for jazz musicians, but there's a lot of other artists in other genres that have used Artist Share. But of course, anybody now can do Kickstarter or
Yeah,
whatever. But
yeah,
Artist Share was basically the beginning of that.
cool. And you've done a few records that way so far, right?
Yeah, I guess this is the fifth CD, and I
Uh-huh.
did two live concert downloads that I released and a series of lessons and things like that.
Cool. Yeah, I like hearing. I mean, like you said, you're still the 20th century mindset. I'm like 15 years younger than you, but I have the same the same mindset for sure. I'm one of those people who likes to have the physical, whether it's a CD, a tape, a record, anything. I like to be able to sit down and read everything in there, get everyone's names, figure out who wrote the songs, and then use that kind of as a jumping off point to
Yeah.
dig for more. Right. So it's nice to see that people are still doing that. And still putting out CDs physically, even though we're kind of in this weird era where that's not necessarily the norm.
Hmm.
If people are hearing about you for the first time on this podcast, what's the best way to track down more of your music, to hear the new record, and just to sort of see what you're up to?
Well, I another recent kind of thing is being much more active on social media. I was applying for some grants, and I wasn't on Instagram.
Okay,
So I am now on Instagram, and I have a lot of posts, and I've been getting some help from friends and students and a publicist. So there's a lot of content there. I'm on Facebook, um, and I think I'm on both as Jon Gordon Music One,
okay,
and my website is jongordonmusic.com. You could also go to Artist Share and just go to the homepage there, and you'll see me. That's a way to get to the new project. Frankly, my old site needs a lot of work,
yeah,
so my website is pretty ancient. We had a 2006 version, then it was like a 2009 version, so it needs some updating. However, there is a lot of content up there. There's a book out. I guess I would tell you I had a book come out
Cool.
on Amazon last year called Jazz Dialogues.
Okay.
And if you just go to Amazon and type in Jazz Dialogues in my name, and it's a Jongordon is spelling of the name, you could find it that way. But really, you can get all my recent CDs on Artist Share.
Okay.
And by all means, hopefully, if folks are in town in Winnipeg and can come to the Rachel Brown Theater,
Yeah.
7 o'clock on October 1st, we'll be there.
Right on.